At 71, I never imagined that I would be sitting in a quiet, unfamiliar room, staring out of a narrow window that didn't even open, wondering how my life had been reduced to a single bed, a small dresser, and the distant sound of footsteps echoing down a hallway that didn't belong to me. And as I folded my hands in my lap that afternoon, I remember thinking how strange it was that everything I had once built, everything I had worked so hard to preserve, could be taken from me not by strangers or circumstance, but by my own daughter. The room itself was neat, almost too neat, as if it had been prepared for someone without a history, without memories, without anything that truly made it theirs. And there were small attempts at comfort, a soft blanket draped over the chair, a framed picture placed carefully on the bedside table, but none of it felt real to me. None of it carried the warmth of a life lived fully, and I found myself sitting there, trying to make sense of how I had gone from a home filled with decades of laughter, arguments, quiet evenings, and familiar routines, to a place where even silence felt unfamiliar. I hadn't agreed to this, not in the way it was presented afterward, not in the finality of it all, and that was the part that stayed with me the most, the quiet way in which the decision had been made around me, as if my voice had become something optional, something that could be acknowledged politely but ultimately ignored, and I didn't realize it at the time. But that moment, that quiet removal from my own life, had been building for far longer than I was willing to admit. My daughter, Claire, had always been strong-willed, even as a child, the kind who knew what she wanted and rarely hesitated to pursue it. And I admired that about her, I truly did, because I believed it would serve her well in a world that often demands certainty. But over time, that strength had shifted into something else, something more controlling, more decisive in a way that left little room for others. And I told myself, for years, that it was simply her way of caring, her way of trying to manage things so I wouldn't have to. But that wasn't the worst part. What hurt most was how easily I had accepted those changes, how I had allowed her to take on more and more decisions without questioning them, how I had convinced myself that it was easier, that it was safer, that perhaps this was just what happened as you got older, that you slowly stepped back and let others take the lead. And I didn't realize it at the time. But in doing so, I had slowly given away something far more important than responsibility. I had given away my voice. I remember the day she first mentioned the idea, how casually it was brought up, almost as if it were a practical suggestion rather than a life-altering decision. And we were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where I had spent years cooking meals, paying bills, building a life piece by piece, and she spoke about extra care and peace of mind, about how it would be temporary, just until things were more manageable. And I listened, nodding slowly, not because I agreed, but because I hadn't yet understood what she was really saying. What happened next changed everything, though I didn't fully grasp it in that moment. And as I look back now, I can see how carefully the conversation was guided, how each concern I raised was gently dismissed, how every hesitation I expressed was met with reassurance that felt comforting at the time. But now, in this quiet room that was never meant to be mine, those reassurances echoed differently, carrying a weight I wasn't prepared to recognize before. The truth is, I didn't fight it the way I should have, not because I didn't care, but because I trusted her, because I believed that no matter what decisions were being made, they were being made with me in mind, with my well-being at heart. And perhaps that was my greatest mistake, not trusting her, but trusting without asking enough questions, without insisting on being part of something that would ultimately change my life so completely. And as I sat there that afternoon, watching the sunlight fade slowly across the floor, I realized that this was not just about where I was now, but about how I had gotten here, about the moments I had overlooked, the decisions I had allowed, the quiet shifts that had led to this place, and a thought began to form in my mind, one that felt both unsettling and strangely grounding. If I had been placed here without fully choosing it, then perhaps there were still choices left for me to make. The first few days passed in a quiet blur, the kind of stillness that feels heavier than noise, and as I adjusted to the unfamiliar rhythm of that place, I found myself observing everything more closely than I ever had before, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to understand where I now belonged, and each morning began the same way, with soft knocks on the door, polite voices asking if I needed anything, and the slow realization that my independence had been replaced by a routine I had never asked for. There were other residents, of course, each carrying their own stories, their own quiet losses, and I would see them in the dining hall or sitting in the common area, some speaking softly to one another while others stared ahead in silence. And I remember wondering how many of them had arrived here willingly, how many had made the choice for themselves, and how many, like me, had simply been placed into a life they hadn't agreed to, but were expected to accept. And that thought lingered with me longer than anything else. Claire visited often in those early days, always composed, always certain, and she would sit beside me with a reassuring smile, speaking about how this was for the best, how I would be safer here, how she could finally stop worrying so much, and I listened to her, nodding gently, because arguing felt pointless in those moments. But there was something in the way she spoke, something final in her tone, that made it clear this was no longer a discussion. It was a decision that had already been made. I remember one particular afternoon when she brought a small bag of my belongings, things she said would make the room feel more like home, and as she unpacked them, placing each item carefully as though arranging a display, I felt a strange distance between us, not physical, but something deeper, something that had quietly grown over time, and I didn't realize it at the time. But that distance had been forming long before I ever stepped into that building. Looking back, I can see how our relationship had changed over the years, how the balance between us had shifted in ways I didn't fully acknowledge. And after her father passed, I had leaned on her more than I probably should have, not emotionally in a way that burdened her, but practically, allowing her to step into roles that gradually gave her more control over decisions, and at the time it felt natural, even comforting, because she was capable, she was organized. She handled things with a confidence I sometimes lacked. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most as those memories began to resurface was how easily I had stepped aside, how willingly I had allowed her to take the lead in matters that once belonged to me, from managing finances to handling appointments, from making small household decisions to larger ones that shaped the direction of my life. And I told myself it was simply part of getting older, part of trusting your children to help you when needed. But I didn't realize that with each small step back, I was giving her more authority than I ever intended. There had been moments, subtle ones, where I felt a quiet discomfort, a sense that something wasn't quite right, like the way she would sometimes speak on my behalf without asking, or how she would dismiss my preferences with a gentle but firm certainty. And I remember feeling that slight hesitation, that small urge to question it, but I would push it aside, telling myself it wasn't worth the tension, that she meant well, that keeping the peace was more important than asserting myself in ways that might create conflict. Over time, those small moments began to connect in my mind, forming a clearer picture of how we had arrived here. And I started to understand that what I was experiencing now was not a sudden shift, not an isolated decision, but the result of a pattern that had been quietly developing for years, one that I had participated in without fully realizing where it would lead. And that realization, though difficult, brought with it a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. I began to pay closer attention to the details around me, not just within the facility, but within myself, noticing how I reacted to things, how I thought about my situation, how I felt when Claire spoke as though everything was already decided. And I realized that while I may have been placed in this room, I had not lost everything. Not entirely, because there was still something within me that had not been taken. The ability to think, to question, to decide what I would accept and what I would not. And as that understanding slowly settled into place, I found myself asking a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, one that lingered quietly in the back of my mind as I watched Claire gather her things to leave that evening, offering me one last reassuring smile before stepping out into the hallway. And that question was simple, almost fragile in its uncertainty. If she believed she had already decided my future, then what would happen when I finally decided to take it back? The days began to settle into a pattern, the kind that feels almost comforting at first, but over time reveals itself to be something far more confining. And I found myself waking each morning to the same soft light filtering through that narrow window, the same distant sounds of carts rolling down the hallway, the same quiet routine that left little room for spontaneity. And while there was a certain order to it all, a structure that some might find reassuring, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that my life had been reduced to something carefully managed rather than genuinely lived. I started noticing the small details more clearly, the way staff members spoke in gentle tones that sometimes felt more rehearsed than sincere, the way decisions were made on behalf of residents without much discussion, and how easily individuality seemed to fade into routine. And I didn't realize it at the time, but those observations were doing something important within me. They were sharpening my awareness, helping me see not just where I was, but how easily a person could disappear into a life that no longer reflected who they truly were. Claire continued to visit regularly, always arriving with the same composed presence, the same calm explanations about how well I was adjusting, and she would ask questions that felt more like confirmations than genuine inquiries, as if she already knew the answers she wanted to hear, and I would respond politely, carefully choosing my words, not out of fear, but because I was beginning to understand that what I said and how I said it mattered more now than it ever had before. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was the growing realization that she genuinely believed she had done the right thing, that in her mind, this was not an act of control or displacement, but one of responsibility, of care. And that belief made everything more complicated because it meant I wasn't simply dealing with a decision. I was dealing with a perspective that had been built over time, reinforced by my own silence, my own willingness to let her take the lead without question. I remember one afternoon when I sat in the common area, watching the television without really paying attention, and there was a woman across from me, not much older than I was, who kept repeating the same story to anyone who would listen, about how she used to have a garden filled with roses and how she missed it more than anything. And at first I thought it was just forgetfulness, just a mind holding on to something familiar. But then I realized it was something more. It was her way of holding on to who she had been, a quiet resistance against being reduced to who she was now. That moment stayed with me long after I returned to my room, because it made me ask myself a question I hadn't fully faced yet. What was I holding on to? And more importantly, what was I allowing to slip away? And as I sat there in the quiet, I began to understand that while I had lost control over certain aspects of my life, I had not lost everything, not unless I allowed it to happen without question. Over time, that thought began to grow stronger, more defined, and I found myself reflecting not just on the present, but on the past, on the decisions Claire had made, the conversations we had shared, the moments where I had felt that slight discomfort but chose not to act on it. And I didn't realize it at the time, but those moments were not insignificant. They were signals small indications that something was shifting in a way that deserved attention. There had been discussions about my finances, about organizing things, about making sure everything was in order, and I had trusted her completely, allowing her access, allowing her involvement, because it felt practical, because it felt like the responsible thing to do. But now, sitting in that room, I began to question those decisions more carefully, not with suspicion, but with a clarity that had been missing before. And I started to wonder just how much control had quietly been transferred without me fully recognizing it. I didn't act immediately because I knew that whatever I chose to do needed to be thoughtful, deliberate, and grounded in understanding rather than emotion. But I also knew that I could no longer remain passive, that continuing to accept things as they were would only lead to a deeper loss of control, and that realization marked a shift within me, one that was subtle but undeniable. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet hum of the building around me, I found myself thinking not about what had already happened, but about what could still happen, about the possibilities that still existed beyond these walls. And a quiet determination began to take shape, not loud or forceful, but steady and persistent. And I realized that while Claire may have made a decision about where I would live, she had not yet determined how my story would end. The realization didn't arrive all at once, but rather settled into me slowly, like a quiet truth that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. And over the next few days, I began to look at everything around me with a different kind of attention. Not as someone trying to adjust, but as someone trying to understand. And I noticed how easily routines can shape a person's sense of reality. How quickly you can begin to accept something simply because it is repeated often enough, and I didn't realize it at the time. But that awareness was the first step toward reclaiming something I had allowed to slip away. I started asking small questions, nothing confrontational or disruptive, just gentle inquiries about how things worked, about policies, about who made decisions and why. And while the answers were always polite, always framed in a way that emphasized care and structure, there was something beneath them that I couldn't ignore, a subtle indication that once you entered a place like this, your autonomy became something managed rather than respected. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Claire visited again that week, carrying the same composed energy she always did. And as she sat across from me, speaking about how well I seemed to be settling in, I listened more carefully than I had before, not just to her words, but to the assumptions behind them. And I realized that in her mind, this chapter of my life had already been finalized, that she saw this arrangement as permanent, even if she didn't say it directly. And that realization brought with it a quiet sense of urgency I hadn't felt until then. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was how easily I could have continued along that path without ever questioning it, how simple it would have been to accept this version of my life, to let the days pass quietly, to adjust and adapt until it all felt normal. And I understood then that the real danger was not the decision itself, but the way it could slowly erase the parts of me that once questioned, that once insisted, that once knew I had a say in how my life was lived. Sometimes I wonder how many people find themselves in situations like this, not through force or cruelty, but through quiet decisions made around them, through gradual shifts that feel too small to challenge until they become too large to ignore. And if you have ever felt that slow loss of control, that subtle fading of your own voice, then perhaps you understand how difficult it can be to recognize the exact moment when acceptance turns into surrender, and how important it is to pause before that line is fully crossed. That evening, after Claire had left, I sat alone in my room and began going through the small collection of personal documents I had brought with me, not with a clear plan at first, but with a growing sense that I needed to understand exactly where I stood. And as I looked through bank statements, insurance papers, and a few older legal documents, I started to piece together a clearer picture of how much involvement she had in my affairs, how much access she had been given over time. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that clarity would soon lead me to a decision I hadn't expected to make. There was one document in particular that caught my attention, something I had signed months before, related to financial oversight. And as I read through it more carefully than I ever had, I noticed details that hadn't stood out to me before, permissions that extended further than I remembered agreeing to, language that placed more authority in her hands than I had intended. And while it didn't mean I had lost everything, it was enough to make me pause, enough to make me question just how much of my life had quietly been handed over without full awareness. Over time, that question began to take shape into something more defined, something that required not just reflection, but action. And I realized that if I wanted to regain control, I would need to do more than simply recognize what had happened. I would need to take deliberate steps to reshape it, to ensure that the decisions about my life were once again being made with me, not for me, and that realization carried a weight that was both daunting and empowering at the same time. I didn't act impulsively because I knew that whatever I chose to do needed to be thoughtful and precise, but I also knew that waiting too long would only allow things to settle further into a pattern that would be harder to change. And so I began to consider my options carefully, thinking about who I could speak to, what steps I could take, how I could begin to reestablish a sense of control without creating unnecessary conflict. And in that quiet process of planning, something within me began to shift once again. And as I sat there that night, the room still and dimly lit, I realized that while Claire may have believed she had secured my future, she had overlooked something important, something that had not been taken from me, something that had simply been waiting beneath the surface, my ability to decide what happens next. And for the first time since I arrived in that place, I felt not like someone who had been placed somewhere, but like someone preparing to move. The decision didn't come to me in a sudden burst of emotion, but rather formed quietly over the next few days, as I sat with my thoughts, revisited those documents, and allowed myself to finally consider something I had avoided for far too long. And it was not driven by anger, not in the way people often expect, but by a growing sense of clarity that felt both steady and undeniable, because for the first time, I was no longer trying to preserve what had been. I was beginning to protect what still remained. I remember sitting at that small desk by the window, the same one that had felt so foreign just days before, and as I looked out at the narrow view beyond the glass, I realized how much of my life had been built on the assumption that trust alone was enough to sustain a relationship, that love, once established, would naturally maintain its balance without needing to be questioned or reinforced. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that belief had left me vulnerable in ways I had never anticipated. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was the understanding that Claire's decisions had not been impulsive or careless. They had been deliberate, shaped over time by a perspective that placed control and certainty above collaboration. And while she may have believed she was acting in my best interest, the result was the same. I had been removed from my own life in a way that left little room for my voice, and that realization, though painful, brought with it a kind of quiet resolve I could no longer ignore. Over time, that resolve began to take shape into something more defined, something that required not just thought, but action. And I found myself returning to an idea that had surfaced briefly before but now felt impossible to set aside. The idea that while I may not have been able to control the decision that brought me here, I could still influence what happened next, particularly when it came to the one thing Claire seemed most certain about, my future. I had a will, of course, something I had arranged years ago when everything in my life felt stable and predictable, and it had been written with trust in mind, with the assumption that the people I left things to would honor not just the assets themselves, but the intentions behind them. And for a long time, I had never questioned it, never felt the need to revisit or revise something that seemed so straightforward. But now, sitting in that quiet room, I began to see it differently, because a will is not just a document. It is a reflection of trust, of belief, of the relationships we think will remain steady even when we are no longer here to guide them. And I realized, slowly but clearly, that the version of trust I had relied on when I created that will no longer reflected the reality I was living in now. And that understanding led me to a conclusion that felt both difficult and necessary. I didn't act immediately because I wanted to be certain, not just of what I was doing, but of why I was doing it. And I spent time thinking about it carefully, considering not just the practical implications, but the emotional ones as well. And I asked myself questions I had never thought to ask before. What did I truly want my legacy to represent? Who had truly stood beside me with respect and understanding? And what message would I be leaving behind if I allowed things to remain as they were? There was no dramatic moment, no sudden decision made in haste, just a quiet acceptance of something that had been building within me for days. And once I reached that point, the next step felt almost natural, and I made arrangements discreetly and carefully to speak with someone who could help me understand how to move forward, how to make changes in a way that was both clear and legally sound. And I didn't realize it at the time, but this step would become the turning point in everything that followed. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced since before I arrived in that place. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was finally taking action, finally stepping into a role I had allowed myself to step away from for far too long. And that shift, though quiet, carried a strength that made everything feel just a little more within reach. And as I sat there that evening, the light fading softly across the room, I realized that this was no longer just about where I lived or what had been decided for me. This was about something far more important. It was about reclaiming the right to shape my own story, to decide how it would unfold, and to ensure that whatever came next would reflect not just what had been taken from me, but what I had chosen to take back. The meeting was arranged quietly, without any mention to Claire, and as I sat in a modest office a few days later, across from a man who introduced himself with a calm and respectful demeanor, I felt a familiar hesitation settle in my chest, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because speaking these things aloud made them undeniably real. And I realized that this was the first time I was taking a step that was entirely my own, not guided, not suggested, not influenced, just mine. I explained everything slowly, carefully choosing my words as if they carried more weight than usual, from the decision that brought me to the nursing home, to the documents I had signed, to the growing realization that my life had been shaped without my full consent. And as I spoke, I watched him listen with a level of attention that felt different from what I had grown used to. There was no assumption in his expression, no quiet dismissal, just a steady focus that allowed me to feel, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that my voice was being heard fully. When I mentioned my will, he nodded slightly and asked a few questions, simple ones at first, about when it had been written, whether it had been updated, who was included. And as I answered, I began to hear my own story from a different perspective, not as something emotional or personal, but as something structured, something that could be examined, adjusted, and redefined. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that shift in perspective would make what came next much easier to face. But that wasn't the most difficult part. What required the most clarity was not the legal process itself, but the emotional acceptance of what I was choosing to do. Because revising a will is not just about paperwork. It is about redefining trust, about acknowledging that the people you once believed would carry your legacy forward may no longer represent that same certainty, and that realization, though quiet, carried a depth I had not fully anticipated. Over time, as the conversation continued, I found myself speaking more openly, more directly, not just about what had happened, but about how it had made me feel, about the quiet loss of control, the subtle ways my voice had been diminished. And as those words left my mouth, I felt something shift within me, something that had been held back for far too long, finally finding its way to the surface. And it wasn't anger or resentment. It was clarity. He explained my options carefully, outlining what could be changed, how it could be structured, what steps would need to be taken to ensure everything was legally sound. And as I listened, I realized that this process was not about taking something away from Claire out of spite, but about restoring balance, about ensuring that what I left behind would reflect the truth of my experience, not just the assumptions that had been made about me. I took my time making those decisions, not rushing through them, not allowing emotion to override thought. And as we went through each detail, each possibility, I felt a growing sense of control returning, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a steady, grounded manner that made everything feel more certain. And I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the moment I had truly begun to reclaim my life. There was a quiet finality to it when the documents were prepared, not heavy or dramatic, but calm and deliberate. And as I reviewed everything one last time before signing, I felt a sense of peace that surprised me, because this was not about loss, not about punishment, but about alignment, about ensuring that my choices reflected my understanding, my values, and my truth. And that alone made it feel right. When I finally placed my signature on those pages, my hand steady and certain, I knew that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. And for the first time since I had arrived at that place, I felt a sense of quiet empowerment, not loud or visible, but deeply rooted, as if I had reconnected with a part of myself that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged again. And as I left that office, stepping back into the world with a calm, measured breath, I realized that while Claire believed she had secured my future through her decisions, she had overlooked something essential, that my story was still mine to shape, and what she had set in motion had not ended my independence. It had awakened it. The days that followed felt different in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Because on the surface, nothing had changed. I was still in the same room, still following the same routines, still surrounded by the same quiet rhythm of the nursing home. And yet, beneath all of that, there was a shift so profound that it altered the way I moved, the way I thought, the way I carried myself. And I didn't realize it at the time. But reclaiming control doesn't always begin with visible change. Sometimes it starts in the quiet certainty that you are no longer powerless. I became more attentive, not just to my surroundings, but to the details of my own life, asking questions when something didn't feel right, taking note of conversations, observing how decisions were made and who was involved in making them. And there was something almost liberating about allowing myself to be curious again, to not simply accept things as they were presented, but to examine them, to understand them, to decide whether they aligned with what I wanted moving forward. Claire continued her visits, though I began to notice subtle changes in the way she interacted with me, perhaps sensing that something had shifted even if she couldn't quite define it, and she would still speak with that same composed tone, still offer reassurances about how everything was under control. But there were moments now where she paused slightly, as if waiting for my response instead of assuming it. And those small pauses, though easily overlooked, carried more meaning than anything she said directly. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered was how I responded, because I no longer nodded automatically, no longer agreed simply to maintain a sense of calm, and instead I chose my words carefully, asking questions where I once remained silent, expressing preferences where I once stepped aside. And while these moments were not dramatic or confrontational, they marked a clear change in the dynamic between us, one that could not easily be ignored. I remember one particular conversation when she mentioned reviewing some of my financial arrangements again, speaking as though it was a routine matter, something already decided. And instead of quietly accepting it, I asked her to explain exactly what she meant, what changes were being considered, who would be involved. And I watched as she adjusted slightly, as if recalibrating her approach. And in that moment, I realized that clarity has a way of shifting power, not through force, but through presence. Over time, I began to prepare for what I knew would eventually need to happen. Not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a conversation where everything that had been left unspoken would finally need to be acknowledged. And I thought carefully about how I would approach it, not from a place of accusation or resentment, but from a place of truth, because I understood now that the goal was not to create distance, but to redefine it in a way that respected both of us without diminishing me. I spent evenings reflecting on everything that had led to this point, not to dwell on it, but to understand it fully, to ensure that when I spoke, I would do so with clarity rather than emotion, with intention rather than reaction. And that preparation became its own form of strength, allowing me to move forward without hesitation or doubt. And yet, even as I prepared, there was a part of me that remained quietly observant, waiting for the right moment, not forcing it, not rushing into it, because I knew that timing matters in ways we don't always recognize, and that when the moment arrived, it would need to be met with calm certainty rather than urgency. I didn't know exactly how Claire would respond, whether she would understand, whether she would resist, or whether she would simply dismiss what I had to say. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel overwhelming, because my actions were no longer dependent on her reaction. They were grounded in my own understanding of what was right for me. And as I sat by that narrow window once again, the same one that had once made me feel confined, I realized that the space around me had not changed. But I had, and that change, though invisible to others, was the foundation for everything that was about to come, because the next step would not be about quiet realization or careful planning. It would be about speaking the truth I had finally come to understand. The moment came more quietly than I expected, not during a dramatic disagreement or a tense exchange, but on an ordinary afternoon when Claire sat across from me, speaking about schedules and arrangements in that same composed tone she always used. And as I listened to her, I realized that this was exactly how it had always happened. Decisions presented as conversations, conclusions wrapped in reassurance, and for the first time, I understood that if I didn't interrupt that pattern, it would simply continue, unchanged and unquestioned. I waited until she finished speaking, allowing a brief silence to settle between us, and then I spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with a calm steadiness that came from everything I had spent days, perhaps even years, preparing to say, and I told her that I needed her to listen, not as someone managing my life, but as my daughter. And there was something in the way those words landed that immediately shifted her attention, as if she sensed that this was not another passive response she could move past. I explained everything, slowly and clearly, not just what had happened, but how it had felt, how being placed there without my full agreement had changed my sense of self, how the gradual transfer of control over my life had left me feeling more like an obligation than a person. And as I spoke, I watched her expression carefully, noticing the moments where she seemed surprised, the moments where she looked uncertain, and even the moments where she seemed ready to respond but held back, perhaps realizing that this time interrupting would not bring the conversation to a close. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered was that I didn't stop, that I allowed myself to say everything I had once chosen to keep quiet, not with blame, not with accusation, but with clarity. And I told her that while I understood she believed she was helping, the reality was that she had taken away something that belonged to me, the right to decide how I live my own life, and those words, simple as they were, carried a weight that could not be softened or dismissed. She tried at first to explain herself, to return to the familiar language of concern and responsibility, but there was a hesitation now, a break in the certainty she once carried, and I realized that hearing the truth spoken so directly had forced her to see something she hadn't fully considered before. Not just the outcome of her decisions, but the impact they had on me. And that realization, however small, marked a shift that could not be undone. Over time, as the conversation continued, I told her about the steps I had taken, about reviewing my documents, about seeking advice, and finally, about the decision I had made to revise my will, and I didn't present it as a threat or a punishment, but as a reflection of the changes in my understanding. And I explained that trust is not something that remains unchanged when actions contradict it, that it evolves just as relationships do. And I could see the moment those words settled in, the moment she understood that something fundamental had shifted. There was a long silence after that, one that felt different from the others we had shared. Not tense or uncertain, but heavy with realization. And I allowed it to remain because sometimes silence is where the truth finds its place. And I knew that whatever she was feeling in that moment was something she needed to process on her own, without interruption, without guidance. Eventually she spoke, not with the same certainty as before, but with a quieter tone, one that carried a hint of something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Reflection, and while she didn't offer an immediate apology or a complete understanding, there was a shift in her words, a recognition that things were not as simple as she had believed. And for me, that was enough, not as a resolution, but as a beginning. I made it clear that this was not about creating distance between us, but about redefining it in a way that respected both of us, that allowed me to live with dignity and autonomy, and her to remain part of my life in a way that did not come at the cost of my independence. And those boundaries, once spoken, felt solid in a way I had never allowed them to be before. And as she sat there, absorbing everything that had been said, I realized that this moment was not about winning or losing, not about proving a point or assigning blame, but about something far more important, restoring balance, not just in our relationship, but within myself. And for the first time since I had been brought to that place, I felt that balance begin to return. After that conversation, nothing changed overnight. And in many ways, that was exactly what made the difference feel real, because life did not suddenly become easier or lighter. There were still routines, still quiet days, still moments where the weight of everything lingered just beneath the surface. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone. And I carried that awareness with me in a way that quietly reshaped everything that followed. Claire's visits became less structured, less certain, and over time, I began to notice small changes in the way she approached me, the way she asked questions instead of presenting decisions, the way she paused, as though considering my perspective before speaking. And while those changes were subtle, they carried a sincerity that had been missing before, and I accepted them not as a resolution, but as a sign that something had been understood, even if only partially. I remained in the nursing home for a time, not because I no longer had a choice, but because I chose to stay while I arranged what came next. And that distinction mattered more than I could have explained to anyone else, because the difference between being placed somewhere and choosing to remain there, even temporarily, is the difference between losing control and reclaiming it. And I held on to that understanding with a quiet sense of strength. Over time, I began making plans, small at first, then more defined, exploring options, speaking to people, considering what kind of living arrangement would allow me both independence and comfort. And for the first time in a long while, those decisions felt like mine again, not guided or suggested, but chosen. And that process, though gradual, brought with it a sense of purpose that I had almost forgotten. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered most was the way I began to see myself differently, not as someone who had been placed aside or managed, but as someone who still had agency, still had the ability to shape her life, to set boundaries, to decide what was acceptable and what was not. And that shift in perspective carried a quiet power that no one could take from me again. Claire and I found a new balance, not perfect, not without its moments of discomfort, but honest in a way we had not been before. And while there were still things left unsaid, still feelings that would take time to fully settle, there was also a growing respect, one that came not from obligation but from understanding. And I realized that relationships do not need to return to what they once were to be meaningful. They simply need to be real. As the weeks turned into months, I eventually moved into a small apartment of my own, a place that was not large or extravagant, but entirely mine. And I remember the first evening I spent there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light fade slowly across the room, and feeling a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the space itself, but everything to do with what it represented. I thought often about how easily things could have continued the way they were, how simple it would have been to accept that version of my life without question, to adjust and adapt until it felt normal. And I realized that the most important change had not been the decisions I made, but the moment I chose to question them, the moment I allowed myself to see clearly what had been happening and to act on that understanding. At this stage in life, I have learned that control is rarely taken all at once. It is given away slowly, in small moments of silence, in decisions we choose not to question, in trust that is offered without balance. And while that realization can feel heavy, it also carries with it something far more important, the understanding that it can be reclaimed in the same quiet, steady way. And as I sit here now, years later, in a home that reflects my choices, my voice, my presence, I no longer think of that nursing home as the place where I was left behind, but as the place where I finally stopped waiting for permission to live my life on my own terms. Because sometimes the moment you feel most confined is the very moment you begin to find your way back to yourself.